Welcome back to another great interview special, everyone. My name is Pat Voss. I'm your host for this Golden Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. Of course, you can also find me at GKPod, on all social media. That is Twitter, that's Instagram, and Facebook. My guest today is a fantastic individual because of the subject matter that we're discussing today, which I'll get into in just a minute. The individual I have to my left, he is a contributing editor of Scientific American, contributing writer for Quanta, author of Complete Idiot's Guide to String Theory and Spooky Action at a Distance. It's George Musser. George, how are you?
Oh, I'm so glad to be here, man. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Now, today's subject, everyone, it's very simple. It's kind of, here and there, we're kind of a hot potato a little bit. Consciousness. That is today's subject. We're going to tackle the problem of consciousness and the concept itself as well. So, George, kind of what is, to lead off today, what are a few things that you want people to know about our everlasting or seemingly everlasting dive into what consciousness is?
Yeah, but let me just start by saying this is a ginormous topic. This is huge. And the word consciousness has a lot of meanings and and this is what makes it fun, right? There's a lot of areas of science, philosophy, medicine, AI, computer science, just really anything, right? Therapy, whatever. It's intersecting on this topic or word. It's not even a topic, word of consciousness that has many topics within it. So just kind of one basic meaning of consciousness. So you kind of have to wonder what we're talking about, right? It's just you gain consciousness when you wake up in the morning or you come out of general anesthesia. So it refers to our kind of waking state in a way. That's actually not what I'll be talking mostly about today, or we'll be talking about today. I'm really talking about consciousness in the sense of our experience of the world. So philosophers, scientists might call this phenomenal consciousness. There's actually different words that are applied to. There's access consciousness, but I'm also other types of consciousness that scientists and philosophers and whatever talk about. I'm talking about phenomenal consciousness, and it means specifically the quality of our experience of the world. So we're not automatons. And probably this is, by the way, when I say us, I'm going to mean humans because that's what we know, but we also could talk about animals. There's a very interesting set of studies about plants and the kinds of intelligence and awareness they might possess. Very different, obviously, from animal consciousness. There's perhaps robot, machine consciousness, but it all, maybe aliens, whatever. But it all starts with humans because we're human, right? And so human consciousness is what I always come back to, but always keeping in mind that I think the ideas are much more broad than that. So we humans have a quality to our experience. We're not just taking information in a mechanical way. If I see red in fact, I do see red on the wall over behind my screen here. It feels like something red. When I see something red, I feel a certain way about red. That's beyond all its implication. If I see a red traffic light, I know I need to stop. Or I should know I need to stop. Sometimes these days you wonder. I don't speed up like most people. I actually come to a stop. So that's the information content of the red is stop. Or I see a red light or whatever. But here I'm talking more about the kind of ineffable significance of the redness of the light. And understanding this is really, really hard because science, the methods of science, and my background is in planetary science, physics and engineering are some of my other kind of intellectual backgrounds, doesn't really get you a handle on that. You really need your poets or your songwriters or all of us talking about our daily experience to get at this red, because it's not something that science naturally gets at. There's no number to it. There's no equation for it. So this leads into what is kind of it's really actually why this is considered one of the great frontier questions of science today. So science has, got a lot of great results under our belt, but there's a lot of questions outstanding. How did life begin? What is matter in the universe ultimately made of? It's not just atoms or particles. Maybe it's something like strings or whatever. And life in the universe, is there life elsewhere? What's it like? But also consciousness is there, and the reason it's on that list is primarily this kind of incompatibility of our current methods for describing the universe don't seem to apply to consciousness. So there's kind of a mismatch there. Whoa! I just lost my light here. So it's called in philosophy and among neuroscientists as the hard problem of consciousness. That's often the term that you'll hear. Is actually, that particular formulation was coined by David Chalmers, who's now a philosopher of mind at NYU. He was at Australia at the time when he came up with that idea. But it's an idea that's been around for a long time. It's kind of the mind-matter split, or the mind-matter duality, that goes back to the origins, really, of Western thought. So back to the Greeks. So this is something that was recognized very early on. And anyway, the point is this incompatibility of our scientific methods and modes of experiment and modes of theory to the questions of consciousness. And if we want to explain consciousness, we do want to eliminate that incompatibility. And there's also, I should say, David Chalmers also talked about the easy problems of consciousness were actually quite hard in their own right. But those are other sets of problems to do with how it occurs and why the visual experience is different from the auditory experience, from the touch experience. How do our neurons work? What kinds of codes do they use in the brain? So there's so many questions around consciousness.
One thing that I wanted to ask, though, because I had a very simple definition. When someone says, "What is consciousness to you?" I say, well, it's the awareness of oneself and one's surroundings, not quite, adding feelings into it. I understand that feelings have to be, there's emotions that do get let into it. But for me, and this is something that I think I suffer from a little bit differently, right? So this is something I'd like to present to you. For us, that we consider ourselves conscious, I'm wondering for myself, suffering from type 1 bipolar disorder, or what they possibly think I'm on the autism spectrum for, like Asperger's.
Mm-hmm.
If I have that, is that the possible lack of empathy, or the possible lack of certain connection of emotions in certain areas? I'm wondering if maybe that's why I feel so kind of cold and calculated in a lot of what I do, because for myself, while others are having these 3-hour-long conversations about consciousness, I boil it down to a very simple definition in my mind, and that is, being aware of oneself and one's surroundings. But I get where you're saying, well, how does that arise? That also presents an issue, and that's something worth delving into as well. But what would you say to someone like myself who sees some of the world's toughest problems, or what seem to be tough problems to talk about, for me, seem like very simplistic ideas? I'm not sure why they seem that way. And I don't know, are we making it harder than it should be, or do we need a new, fresh pair of eyes on this in order to access new ideas?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think you're really on the right track with everything that you've said. And consciousness is such a umbrella term. There's a lot that's clustering underneath that umbrella. And awareness is absolutely part of that. To your later points, I do think we need more eyes on it. I think there's a lot of basic neuroscience and other fields of science, but certainly neuroscience, that has to be brought on this. So discoveries will have to be made, but also someone's going to have to come in, like an Einstein, a new Einstein, and look at the existing understanding and rethink it. And it's going to be a beautiful moment when that happens. And it may happen, by the way, collectively. It may not be one Einstein. It may be 1,000 people, each bringing something to it, and together an understanding is reached. So to awareness, yes, awareness is absolutely part of. In fact, when we talk about being conscious, we talk about being aware of something. I'm conscious of the light in my room, or which means in tangible terms, I'm aware of it. My attention is drawn to it. I can, even if I close my eyes, I can imagine light in the room. I know, so there's a bunch of things that awareness kind of translates into. But there's other parts of it as well. So this quality of experience, this feeling, was one other part of it as well. That's a part I identify with, but what you're saying is absolutely valid as well. Each of us comes to this in a different way. And I think, or I should say this, the evidence suggests that this is absolutely a human universal, that people have experience and an awareness across the huge diversity of tens of billions of people through history. So all of us are coming to it a slightly different way. So your understanding will be different from mine, and that's actually part of what makes it interesting, and part of makes it a scientific and a human problem. It's different from mine, different from anyone's, and I think that's cool. That's actually what makes it a fun field, but also makes it difficult for science to grapple with.
One thing you mentioned earlier was more of a mind matter problem, and I'm wondering about that a little bit. I'm wondering about the problem of what a lot of people would call like a mind body problem, and understanding or not understanding. I don't want to say understanding, because to me, unfortunately, I'm under the impression that they have it incorrect in the very assumption of the phrasing. So saying mind body problem to me sounds as if we're making it like they're two separate things. And as far as my understanding goes, the brain is the main function. It's your main running system, and your body is the shell that, while it encapsulates everything else within it, your body is run by your brain. So I'm wondering why there's such an issue, because I think we're kind of invoking, and you can completely tell me if I'm wrong on this one. I feel like we're almost invoking the idea of, when we say we or my brain, when we say the my or our, when we're saying that our, when we're talking about that, the relatability to use that term, I think, is what is fooling people into thinking that there's two separate entities when there seems to be only clearly one. I'm not sure where the mental breakdown is at, and if there is one, or I'm just kind of crass maybe in a way.
Yeah, so you've touched on a lot of really interesting questions, and I think your intuition is exactly right. There's really no divides here. Now, here, let me take a step back and just kind of analyze why we say that there's a mind-body problem. It's us. It's our way we understand the world. And the similar thing, let me just pull out to an analogy, comes up in physics a lot. And this is my background, so this is how I think about these things. That nature is unified. The natural universe is unified, but we have a patchwork of theories. We've got one for electromagnetism, we've got one for gravity, we've got one for thermal effects. So we take this and we quilt them together and try to put that on to nature. And of course, it's not going to match up, because nature is a unity and we're capturing it in a piecemeal fashion. But I think with the progress of and I think this is just the way humans work. This is kind of trade-off, or we're limited creatures, right? We're only around on this earth for, God willing, 80 some years. We're only see what we see. We only know what we know. We only meet whom we meet. We have these limitations. So we make the best of it by dividing and conquering. We say, well, I can't do everything, so I'll be an expert in this area, or I will specialize in that topic. And this is kind of how intellectual thought works. No one person can do everything. That would just be like pretending you're God, right? We're not. Right. We're just what we are. We just do what we can. We're given the gift of these brains. We do the best we can with them, and we come up with this patchwork. So it is with our own constitutions. We are unities. our mind, our body, other aspects that we may not even have names for are together. They're cohering, but we approach it in a patchwork fashion. As you said, we have a theory of the body. We have a developing theory of the mind. They don't seem to connect. We know they have to connect. Maybe because that's the natural world, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's going to take time. So we do the best we can. So we take our theories of matter, such as the body as being one part of matter, and we try to see whether we can extract the mind from it. It turns out we can't, because those theories are written in their own language. They're written mathematically, symbolically. They're a type of description we use that's like the descriptions we use of voltages. I'm a double E major in a college student, so I think a lot in terms of electrical phenomena, also computers. But we know that language is ultimately going to be inadequate to the psychological life that we have. And the goal here of the hard problem, so-called, is to make our descriptions match their subject matter. As you say, at the end of the day, if we're successful, if we, humanity, not me, because this, or you, this is way past our lifetime.
Right.
If humanity is successful, then we will have a truly unified view of the conscious individual, who may not be human by that point, maybe a robot or whatever. But the point is of that conscious subject.
One thing that I notice you're saying is we're looking for some kind of unification. And I notice that with a lot of things as well, with physics. You're talking about general relativity and quantum mechanics, trying to look for some field theory, a unified field theory, right? How do we make that work? But I was listening recently to an interview that Leonard Susskind gave, and he mentions that maybe we don't, and this is something that kind of occurs to me from time to time, but maybe we don't need the unifying theory. Maybe they do in fact work on two different types of laws, two different types of scenarios. In quantum mechanics, talking about subatomic particles and the such, and in general relativity, talking about things like gravity and planets and much larger objects. Even us as a whole, we would consider ourselves in classical physics instead of quantum mechanics, I would think. So I'm wondering, this is why I say, is it simpler than we're making it? Because, are we making this harder on ourselves? Because to me, I view things most like Mr. Susskind said, and he says that maybe we don't need to combine the two, and I don't know if we necessarily need to combine body and mind. We understand that the body works in a certain way. We understand it works in this way. But maybe in the mind and the electrical systems going on in our brains and the different neurological pathways reforming, the fact that today we can, when we're talking about seeing memories form and what the brain is doing to form memories, that to me shows something on a different level than what we're doing at a much larger scale if you zoom back out on that. So I don't know if it will ever end the search for this unified theory of some sort, or if eventually scientists, I mean, what do you think? Will scientists eventually give up and say, maybe they work on two different levels, maybe we shouldn't bother with this? Or is it always going to be something that's going to be nagging at the back of somebody's brain?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's different, right? And by the way, each of us is different. So Lenny Susskind is a great example of this, because he's musing in this case, well, maybe we will never patch together these different, separate theories and we'll need to maintain their distinctions between the particle theories, the gravity theory, and so forth. And, probably an hour later, he was back over there trying to figure out how to unify them. And so he goes back and forth in his own mind. And this is great. Let's go back and forth. Let's think about this. So here, I guess if at the end of the day, I think there's a unity there, and I think we can capture it. So those are two very strong statements. They'll only be tested over time. But I base it based on what I've seen science do so far and kind of my aspirations for it. So we've seen different things in the natural world that we see on inspection as we analyze them turn out to be manifestations of the same thing. That's the unification concept. Now, it may stop at some point, but so far that's kind of plus. We've gotten to points in the history of science, and not just science, by the way, it's true of everything humans do. We get to a point, nobody can run a mile faster than 4 minutes, right? We get to these points where we think we've really hit a limit. And then actually we do surpass it. So I think we've kind of reached that kind of point now with a lot of these problems. We think they're beyond us. In fact, we think they're beyond any rational thought. So that's Lenny Susskind in his pessimistic moment. And then, maybe he sleeps on it. He goes out for a beer. He talks to some buddies and he says, well, actually, maybe we can make progress. So we go back and forth on it a lot. And I want to hear more of your thoughts on this, but just one more idea on this, which I think is really, to me, one of the reasons to seek unity is because when we unify what we know, we learn things we don't know. We learn things we never even suspected at all. Electricity and magnetism are the perfect examples. It starts off with lodestones, magnetic compasses. Then there's like static electricity. They look completely different. It's amazing that people figured out that they were unified. So it's unified in the 1870s or so, 1860s, I guess. Those electricity and magnetism are put together. And guess what we learn? We learn, wait, there's also electric current, not just static, dynamic electricity. That powers the whole whole world right now, right? Electricity. We learn about radio. We learn about infrared, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays, the spectrum of light that is beyond the ability of our eyes to see. This is what I hope will happen with all these unification projects. I think with the unification of physics, once they do get the quantum and the gravity to unify, we'll learn something completely out of left field. We won't have any idea what's coming. And it's going to be amazing. And it's going to be the technology of 800 years from now, or whatever number. It's going to come back into our lives and be hugely significant. Same thing with the mind-body problem. Once we unify them, there's going to be some third thing over here that you don't even know. It's probably right in front of your eyes. You don't even know it yet. It's going to come in and it's going to help us. And that's what I'm excited by.
One thing I noticed you said, and this is before I ask my final, because the final question is coming up about, we'll get to that in a second. Something you said when they figure it out. It wasn't an if. I noticed that there was no if. There was definitely a when, and I while I enjoy the confidence behind that, I have to ask: is that something that is that how your brain operates? That you think that these are more of a, search the pattern of history and technological advancement and scientific advancement, and that leads you to believe that it is a when and not an if?
I mean, you could argue it either way, and I'm like Lenny or like you or like anyone. I'm a mix of different feelings, right? None of us is consistent. We ask for people to be consistent in our daily lives or political lives or whatever. And no, we're complicated beings. And I'm complicated like them all. So at that moment I was saying that, and I think broadly, like 75% of me thinks it's doable. So I think 75% of me says when. But yeah, I get it. I get that there's a chance that might not happen, in which case it's an if, or it's like a seeking of some other way altogether here. I mean, I don't know. As I said, we just are who we are. We're little creatures, and we'll let history figure it out, and we'll just do our part as the history is unfolding. As I said, 75% of me thinks it will happen. Yeah, but you could convince me it could go the other way. I'm not clinging to that like to the death.
So then this is my final question. Something that I've seen with what Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson has said before, and nothing that he said in an interview, but just he said, this idea keeps me up at night. He said that. I thought about that. And I keep wondering for different scientists, for different people that like yourself, that are considering consciousness and on a daily basis, you're doing these things. And I'm wondering, what is something about consciousness? What problem of consciousness, and I'm sure there are many, but what main problem keeps you up at night with concerning consciousness, that you're like, man, that is really something I hope is solved before I pass away, because I really want to know?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's a good question. I mean, I should say, when people say that, they're really speaking mostly metaphorically. Most people aren't really staying up at night with these problems. Most of us are staying up at night because, oh God, did I put out the garbage, right? Or did I lock the kitchen door? Those little things. But in terms of what I'm thinking about, and this is always the case in science, it helps to have other cases to help. So when we're understanding the Earth's climate, we look to Mars, we look to Venus, other planets, to understand that a little bit. This is my own field of planetary science. It's one of the reasons I started it, was to understand our own Earth better by referring to other worlds where things have played out quite differently. And I would like us to have other examples of consciousness. And I think that would be a huge, huge help on a lot of levels. I think it might change art, for example. I think other consciousness systems would create new forms of art, music, and they would help us reflecting with the scientific questions of consciousness. So other forms, what do I mean? Aliens obviously would be a big one. That's hard to predict. I think we'll probably learn about extraterrestrial life, whether it exists, within my lifetime, because I think the telescopes are reaching that capability, and they're looking at different planets. So there's a program to get there, but you can't guarantee they'll know about alien consciousness or intelligence. So I think we'll probably find out more about animals, and it's happening all the time. We'll find more about plants. I mentioned that a little earlier. It's quite interesting. But I think the one that's really going to help a lot is machines. Because I think if we create, we being humanity again, not me, we create a conscious computer, conscious AI system, AC system, you could call it. We would be able to engage in a dialogue with that system and learn a lot about consciousness. So I wouldn't say it keeps me up at night, but certainly gets my blood and makes me excited to think might have these artificially conscious systems. Now, before I turn it back over to you, I should just say, in like Terminator and all these movies, the artificial conscious system is the last thing you want, right? So they take over. But I don't think there's a risk here. I think there's very much a danger with AI systems that they might probably not take over the world, but they could steer it in ways we don't really want, like algorithmic bias and all that comes up with Facebook and whatever.
Yes.
Or helping the surveillance state of different governments. So I think we already have plenty of problems with AI, but artificial consciousness isn't a risk. In fact, I think it's going to be very vulnerable when we create those systems. They'll be almost like we'll have to protect them. They're not going to be dangerous to us. They're going to be something we need to help. And I think that's going to be a huge help to us in return, because we'll be confronted with something that's different from us and we'll be able to communicate. Maybe their experience of time. Time's always a big puzzle in these kinds of things. The time will be different. Right now, our window of time is like 1/10 of a second. So we see things over very short windows. What if there was a second long or 10 minutes? How would that be different? It'd be amazing, right? I want to talk to those artificial conscious systems and hear what it's like to have a different experience of time. I think we'd learn a lot.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I was going to say about the Terminator type of systems, and that's what kind of made me laugh, is the scientific famous last words. Let's try it this way. That kind of sticks with me a bit. So before we get going today, I want you to tell people, how can people reach you on social media if they wanted to follow you on social media? How could they get a hold of you?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter. Just search for G Musser, Gmusser. I'm just at G Musser. I have an Instagram account. I don't really keep up with that much. I've got a Facebook page that's dedicated to my work. You can also search for that. But I think Twitter is probably your best option. And I keep it pretty, I'm not one of these insane Twitter people. I don't tweet a lot. I tweet things that I come across that I find interesting, like new scientific discoveries. Every now and then I'll throw some other kind of weird comment in, but I think you'd be safe following me on Twitter. There's nothing too crazy there. And my book on consciousness and these kinds of topics like artificial consciousness, on physics and consciousness, is supposed to come out next year sometime. Don't know exactly when, but I'll mention that on my Twitter account.
Okay, absolutely. And I wanted to make a quick after I do an outro here, I wanted to make a quick correction on what I said earlier about my social media feeds, because I actually messed those up. So my guest today has been contributing editor of Scientific American, contributing writer for Quanta, author of Complete Idiot's Guide to String Theory and Spooky Action at a Distance, George Musser. George, thank you so much for being my guest today.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
And I have been your host here for the Golden Knowledge Podcast on YouTube. Now, I have to say, the Twitter, the Instagram, and the Facebook are actually Golden K Pod, not GK Pod. Golden K Pod. That is where you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And of course, Golden Knowledge Podcast here on YouTube. I will see you in the next episode.